happy to be here with you, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule, busy day to join us. Before we get started, I'm going to briefly mention a few logistics. The WebEx connection instructions have been placed in the chat. If you have any issues with your connection, please reach out to us at FedNow Community, all one word, at chi.frb.org. Again, that's SYS, FedNow Community at chi.frb.org. We have a full agenda today, so I'll kick us off by introducing our speakers. With me today are Michelle Bamani from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Ingrid Wang from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and Casey Rooney, also from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Michelle and Ingrid are from our legal group and are joining us today to provide an overview of the terms and conditions for the FedNow service as outlined in Operating Circular 8. Casey joins us from the FedNow Business Operations team, and she will guide us through an overview of the FedNow service and the operational details covered in the FedNow Service Operating Procedures. Lastly, and here is where you come in as our audience, we're leaving plenty of time to answer your questions. So please submit your Q&A, submit your questions via the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen over the course of our session today. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid to start our presentation.
Thanks, Jesse. So before we get started, this would not be a legal presentation if I did not give you a disclaimer. So today's program, we're going to cover certain legal topics that are relevant to Operating Circular 8, which is titled Funds Transfers Through the FedNow Service. You'll hear us refer to it as OC8. But none of the content that we are going to share with you today should be construed as legal advice. Really encourage you, if your legal counsel is not on today, that you get with them afterwards and consult with them about matters that are covered during our program today. And before we jump into it, I'm going to turn it over to Casey here, but we are so excited that there's such a diverse group of attendees here today, but we realize that you all may be on different kind of paths, and some of you may be very early on in your FedNow service journey, and this is kind of your first introduction. And so that's why before we actually get into the content of OCA and some of the operating procedures, Casey's going to give us a quick overview of the FedNow service payment flows. Casey, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. So as Ingrid mentioned, this payment overview is meant to really set the stage for the presentation today on Operating Circular 8 and the operating procedures. So jumping into the payment flow with step 1, which is initiation. So the sender, either an individual or a business, will initiate a payment with their FI through an end user interface, which is outside of the FedNow service. The FedNow sender FI is responsible for validating the payment according to its internal processes and requirements. Moving to step 2, the sender FI then submits a payment message to the FedNow service. In step 3, the FedNow service validates the payment message, for example, by verifying the message meets proper format specifications and complies with all applicable controls. If the message passes these validations, the process proceeds to step 4, where the FedNow service sends the contents of the payment message to the recipient's FI to seek confirmation that the receiver FI intends to accept the payment message. At this point, the receiver FI will determine how to handle the message, either accept, reject, or accept without posting. Among other things, the receiver FI should use this step to ascertain whether it maintains an account for the recipient identified in the contents of the payment message. The operating procedures provide more detail on this and the other steps, but I want to highlight here the response options and related requirements for a receiver FI. If the receiver FI accepts the payment message and the FedNow service settles the payment, the receiver FI is then required to post the funds immediately to their end customer. Later in the session, Michelle will talk more about the posting of funds immediately. If the receiver FI rejects, they must provide a reason for rejecting. And the final response option is accept without post. When accept without post is used in response to a payment message, the FedNow service settles the transaction with finality, debiting and crediting the master account of the participants. As a result of its accept without post response, the receiver FI is relieved of the corresponding obligation to make funds immediately available to its end customer, providing the receiver FI an opportunity for it to investigate. The operating procedures have additional details of the requirements related to when a participant can use accept without post and requirements related to follow-up actions after accepting without post. So moving to step 5, in this example flow, the receiver FI sends a positive response of accept to the FedNow service, confirming it intends to accept the payment message. Step 6, the FedNow service settles the payment, debiting and crediting the designated master accounts of the sender FI and the receiver FI or of their correspondents. Steps 2 through 6 are expected to complete within a few seconds, but will take no more than 20 seconds. The 20-second time frame is referred to as the FedNow service timeout clock. If processing of an instant payment exceeds the 20 seconds, the transaction will time out, the FedNow service will reject the message and inform the participants. In step 7, the FedNow service sends an advice to the receiver FI and an acknowledgement to the sender FI, executing the payment order and notifying each that the Federal Reserve Banks settled the payment message. Step 8, funds availability and notification to the customer. As mentioned, when the receiver FI responds with accept and the FedNow service settles the payment, the receiver FI must make funds available immediately to the end recipient after step 7. So hopefully this sets the stage as we dive into more information on the operating circular and the operating procedures. But this diagram, along with the steps, are available for reference in the Service Readiness Guide, which can be found on the FedNow Explorer site. So speaking of the Service Readiness Guide, we can move to the next slide to talk through some of the resources that are available to the public to learn more about the FedNow service. So starting with Operating Circular 8 and other applicable circulars, those are available on frbservices.org and provide the terms and conditions for the FedNow service. Next, the FedNow Service Operating Procedures, also available on frbservices.org, provide an operational description of the FedNow service, including expectations, requirements, and guidance for FedNow participants. The Service Readiness Guide, as mentioned, is available on the FedNow Explorer site and presents information that FIs and service providers should consider as they prepare for the FedNow service. And finally, the FedNow Service ISO 20022 Implementation Guide, available on My Standards, provides a business-oriented description of the ISO 20022 messages that are in scope for Release 1 of the FedNow service. And now with that, I will hand it over to Ingrid.
Okay, thanks, Casey. So before we dive into the substance of the circular, want to talk about what an operating circular is. So if you use any other Federal Reserve financial services, you may be familiar with these. If you use like FedWire Funds or FedACH, an operating circular essentially just outlines the terms and conditions for using a particular Federal Reserve financial service. So in this case, we're talking about Operating Circular 8 because that is what is going to govern the FedNow service. So you'll see here on the slide is a link to frbservices.org. If you go down on the Resources tab, Rules and Regulations, it'll take you to the Operating Circular page, where you will also be able to, in addition to the Operating Circular, find the operating procedures that Casey just referenced. So now I think we're ready to dive into the actual substance of what we're here to talk about today. So Michelle, I'm going to hand it off to you to kick us off.
Next slide, please. Thank you very much, Ingrid. So far, we've received some helpful background from Ingrid and Casey on the Operating Circular 8. What I'm hoping to accomplish now is to give us the legal framework surrounding the FedNow service and where the Operating Circular fits within that framework. So what is the legal framework? There are 3 separate items that I'll mention today which play a role in how the legal framework for the FedNow service is organized. Those 3 items are Regulation J, which I'll refer to as Reg J, the Uniform Commercial Code 4A, which I'll refer to as UCC 4A, and then the operating circular, which I'll call OC8. So we take a step back. In June of 2022, the Federal Reserve Board issued the final ruling, which amended Reg J by adding a third part to it, Subpart C. And this Subpart C incorporated a FedNow service and specified the terms and conditions under which the reserve banks will process funds transfer over the FedNow service. In this Subpart C of Reg J, the board incorporated a provision of within UCC 4A. This idea of incorporating UCC 4A as the underlying framework is similar to existing Federal Reserve services, such as our FedWire Funds service, which is also governed by UCC 4A. So additionally, in addition to making UCC 4A the underlying framework for the FedNow service, Reg J also provided that UCC 4 applies to all funds transferred in the FedNow service. So another thing that Reg J did is it granted the reserve banks the authority to issue an operating circular for the FedNow service, hence Operating Circular 8, which we're talking about. And Operating Circular is to govern the FedNow service, and OC8 was published in September 21st of this year, so not a couple months, a little less than a couple months ago. So just to reiterate everything, the general hierarchy is as follows. You have Reg J, which sets the governing law and includes UCC 4A as the underlying framework. And then you have the Operating Circular, which sets some of the terms. And then there are other business-related documents, such as the operating procedures, which Casey has discussed, that have additional specification. In fact, if you were to look at section 3.1 of OCA, and we'll do this from time to time, where we'll point you to specific section within the operating circular. So if you haven't had the chance to read it, you can go back later and see exactly what we're talking about. But section 3.1 of OCA specifically calls out and provides requirement to follow the operating procedure as well by saying that each FedNow participant and service provider, if any, is required to follow the FedNow service operating procedure and technical specification, which the Reserve Bank may issue and amend from time to time. So when you're reading OC8, bear in mind that the operating procedures and the technical specifications are where you would need to go to see some operational specificity. Now, there are some similarity OC8 with other existing operating circulars that are present in the Federal Reserve System. So for those of you who've dealt with other operating circulars in the system, OC8 might be somewhat familiar. So for example, the FedNow service is a funds transfer service. So in that way, we are similar to our FedWire Fund service, and we draw from Operating Circular 6, which controls the FedWire Fund service. Also, we draw from OC1, and OC1 deals with account relationship and applies to our payment services. Finally, we also draw from OC5, and OC5 deals with electronic access to our services, so it will also be applicable. Now, this is because the FedNow service is a payment service, right? So it will need to have electronic access as well. That's why we draw from all these other operating circulars. Of course, OC8 takes into consideration the fact that the FedNow service has some specificity and uniqueness to it. So the uniqueness of a FedNow service, such as the retail use case of the FedNow service, or that the FedNow service will allow participants to be able to settle using their own master account or a correspondence account. And that's unique to the FedNow service, the ability to settle using their own correspondence account. So when you're looking at OCA, be aware that other operating circulars will also play a role and sometimes be applicable. Now, I want to talk about one specific item which we've received a lot of questions about, and that's funds availability. Now, the reason why I want to specifically talk about funds availability besides the it will allow that when we talk about this, you'll also give you a sense of the interplay between Reg J, UCC 4A, OC8, and the operating procedure. So if you were to look at Reg J, Section 210.44B1 of Reg J states that, quote, a beneficiary's bank, other than the Federal Reserve Bank, that accepts a payment order over the FedNow service is obligated to pay the amount of the order to the beneficiary of the order immediately after its acceptance of the payment order by crediting an account of the beneficiary in accordance with Section 4A 405A of Article 4A. So here what Reg J did, Reg J shows you how it's using UCC4 as the underlying framework for funds availability, and then creates the immediately standard. And also the Reg J points to UCC4A. So what is OCA? So accordingly, OCA then takes this Reg J obligation and has a provision, specifically Section 9.3 of OC8. And Section 9.3 of OC8 states that a FedNow receiver will have met its obligation under this section and Reg J to make funds available to the beneficiary immediately if, following acceptance of the instant payment message, the FedNow receiver credits an account of the beneficiary in accordance with Section 4A of Article 4A within the time framework outlined in the FedNow Service Operational Procedures. So here, OCA takes the Reg J's rule and tells you that a FedNow receiver meets the obligation if it credits in accordance with UCC 4A and within the time frame outlined in our operating procedures, right? So if you follow this thread, what you'll see is that then the operating procedure, and if you go specific to Section 5 of the operating procedure, the operating procedures refer to immediately to mean as soon as practicable, but no longer than a few seconds. So to summarize, the funds have to be made available immediately. And that's defined, if you follow operating procedure, to mean as soon as practicable, but no longer than a few seconds. Now let's remember, the reason why it's defined as such is because this is instant payment, so the payment needs to be made instantly. Now, I hope this gives you a little idea of the interplay between how we take Reg J, use UCC 4 as the underlying framework, and then OCA and the operating procedure give you a sense of the interplay and how it's all placed together. So with that being said, Ingrid, let me hand back to you the virtual baton so you can walk us through some important definitions.
Thanks, Michelle. Yep, great, thank you. So the next several minutes, we're going to take some time to talk about some important definitions and concepts that you're going to find in the operating circular. And before we get into these specific concepts and definitions, I do want to note, like we've said multiple times now throughout this presentation, that these are detailed in much more detail in the operating procedure. And to that end, Casey is going to join me here in just a couple minutes to provide some additional detail on how these particular concepts are going to be operationalized. So with that, I want to start with our first definition. So FedNow participant. That is a financial institution authorized by a reserve bank to send, receive, or settle messages through the FedNow service. So Michelle alluded to other operating circulars earlier, and specifically to Operating Circular 1. Here's a definition where we're going to refer back to another operating circular. So Operating Circular 1 defines what a financial institution is. But along that lines, I would emphasize here that a service provider is not included in this definition, as service providers typically are not financial institutions. Moving on to our next definition. So every FedNow participant is going to be required to designate a settlement account where they're going to settle all their FedNow service obligations. A FedNow participant may choose to use their own master account, or they may use a correspondent. And so a correspondent is a financial institution that maintains a master account with a reserve bank and has agreed to maintain a settlement account for another FedNow participant. And importantly, I would note here, if you're a financial institution that is going to act as a correspondent for another financial institution, you can also be a FedNow participant yourself. Next is service providers. So service providers, participants are going to be allowed to use service providers to conduct several activities on their behalf, which may include initiating, transmitting, or receiving messages. You can also use a service provider to manage your electronic connection. Michelle alluded to Operating Circular 5, which talks about electronic connection. So that's going to be allowed, permitted in the FedNow service, but I would note that service providers and the FedNow participant that they're going to be supporting will be required to sign Appendix B, and that essentially binds that service provider to the terms of OCA. That Appendix B is found at the back of Operating Circular 8. So now we want to transition to the three different message types that the FedNow service is going to support. The first two, instant payment messages and liquidity management transfer payment messages. Could not get a longer definition there if we tried, but those are value messages. So those are going to generate an accounting entry on the books of a reserve bank. And then the last type of messages, non-value messages. So first want to talk about instant payment messages. So this is kind of the crux of the FedNow service. These are your customer credit transfers, and these are covered extensively in Section 9.2 of the operating circular. So while we don't have time to get into the specifics there, I would really encourage you to consult with your legal counsel and make sure you really review Section 9.2. So next we have liquidity management transfers. So these are transfers that are going to be used to support instant payment liquidity needs. So these are transfers sent through the FedNow service to transfer funds between settlements accounts or to and from an excess balance account or a joint account that backs a private sector instant payment system. So if you're familiar with the FedNow or FedWire fund service, these are similar in many respects to bank-to-bank messages or BTR code type 16 that are sent through FedWire funds. And then the next type of message is non-value messages. So in contrast to the value messages, these are messages that aren't payment orders. They're not going to generate any type of accounting entry. And these include things like requests for payment, requests for information about a previously sent customer credit transfer, and return requests. I would note these are also detailed, different kinds of non-value messages much more extensively in the operating procedures. And to that end, I'm going to ask Casey if she could step in here and provide some context on how these different message types can be operationalized in the FedNow service.
Yes, thanks, Ingrid. So when deciding how to operate on the FedNow service, FedNow participants will select participation types, which will then indicate the features and messages, value or non-value, that the FI will offer or support. And generally, FIs will be able to enable combinations of participation types with a few exceptions. So as it relates to credit transfer and request for payment capabilities, FIs will have the option of credit transfer receive only, credit transfer send and receive, or credit transfer send and receive with the ability to accept requests for payments. And to highlight the difference of these participation types, the credit transfer receive only will not be enabled to send instant payments, so those PAXO 8 or PAXO 4 messages, while the credit transfer send and receive will be enabled to both send and receive instant payments. And finally, the credit transfer send and receive with the ability to accept requests for payments will be enabled to both send and receive instant payments, and these RTNs can also receive requests for payments. As it relates to liquidity management capabilities, FIs will have the option of liquidity management transfer receive only or liquidity management transfer send and receive. So FIs can combine any of the credit transfer participation types with the LMT participation types, for example, to enable an RTN to be credit transfer receive only and LMT send and receive. The final participation type, settlement only, is reserved for correspondent FIs, which would enable correspondents to receive real-time notices and reporting of debits or credits for their respondents. Again, all of this information related to participation types and the subsequent value and non-value messages that are supported can be found in the operating procedures. I'll hand it back to you, Ingrid.
Thanks, Casey. That was really helpful. So the next two, I'll cover our last two definitions here. So the first is FedNow Service Funds Transfer Business Day. That is a mouthful. Try to say that 10 times fast, but this is the funds transfer business day for the FedNow service that is going to be published on the FedNow service schedule, which will be on frbservices.org. So that website we showed you earlier, you go to the same place to find the FedNow service schedule. So obviously the FedNow service, like we mentioned, is going to operate 24/7, 365 each day of the week. But this definition specifically is tied to cutoff times. So that's the time at which and after a message is going to be treated as received on the next funds transfer business day. And then lastly, standard business day. So this means the Reserve Bank's core operating hours during each weekday other than a Reserve Bank holiday. So once again, as you're going to see in the operating procedures, there are a host of FedNow service related activities that are not going to be fully available outside of core operating hours on a weekday. So some of these examples include correspondent respondent changes, mergers, account openings and closings. Those are all things that, while related to the FedNow service, you're not going to be able to do those 24/7, 365. So I encourage you to make sure you understand what those services are and what is and isn't available 24/7, 365. Casey, is there anything you'd like to add here?
Yeah, so I'll just touch on, and as you mentioned, the FedNow service is 24/7, 365 with no expectations of planned downtime. So each FedNow participant and service provider should maintain the ability to receive and if applicable, send messages through the FedNow service and make funds immediately available to its customers on a 24-hour basis each FedNow service funds transfer business day. The reserve banks do recognize that participants and service providers may need downtime for plan maintenance, especially as they start on the FedNow service. So participants' planned downtime should not exceed 2 sequential hours or 24 hours total per quarter, and any planned downtime should be scheduled during hours with expected minimal transaction volume. The reserve banks have not established specific downtime windows, which does provide participants and service providers with the flexibility to perform maintenance on a schedule that works best for each organization. So with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle to talk about the scope of the FedNow service.
Thank you very much, Casey. FedNow Service Funds Transfer Business Days. There's going to be a test at the end of this to see who can say that the fastest, so I hope people practice. All right, so scope of the service. So far we've talked about the legal framework and some important definitions that are key to understanding the FedNow service. What I want to cover now is who can have access to the FedNow service and how can it be used. So 2 sections partly address these questions. On the who part, we have section 5.1 of OC8. And section 5.1 of OC8 says that a FedNow participant includes financial institution eligible under applicable law to become account holder as defined in Operating Circular 1. So again, that what Ingrid was talking about, the interplay between Operating Circular. Here, the OC1 definition of an account holder plays a role. And if you want to figure out who can be an eligible account holder, you will need to refer to OC1's definition. Eligibility is further limited by the Federal Reserve policy and the Administrative Reserve Bank's discretion. Administrative Reserve Bank is a defined term in OC8, so you should look at the definition section of OC8. That's on the who side. On the how, so how can the service be used? The relevant section here is 9.1.2 of OC8. Essentially, this section says that a FedNow participant may not send a payment order through the FedNow service to an originator or beneficiary that is not either A, FedNow participant, or B, a holder of a deposit account on the books of the FedNow sender or receiver in the United States. So here the FedNow participant can include transaction for IMT purposes between participant as described by Ingrid. However, the customer of the FedNow participant, they have to be holding deposit accounts in the United States. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Fraud. So the Federal Reserve Bank takes fraud seriously, and some aspect of FedNow service will deal with fraud. Namely, at the first release of the FedNow service, there will be 2 specific appendices dealing with fraud, Appendix C and Appendix D. For those of you who have dealt with other Federal Reserve services, these 2 appendices are different than other appendices present in our other services. So I'd advise that you carefully read those, as they likely present new items that you may not be familiar with. Appendix C specifically focuses on fraud reporting, and Appendix D focuses on the negative list. Let's start with Appendix C on fraud reporting. The first 2 provisions of Appendix C define terms, and then the remaining provision outline the requirements for a participant to investigate when a customer reports a fraudulent payment. So let's go back to the main text of OC8 first. So if you go back to 12.4 of section 12.4 of OC8, participant there will be required to report transaction process to the FedNow service that they are investigated and confirmed to be fraudulent. Confirmed to be fraudulent means that they believe in good faith was the result of fraudulent activity. So if a participant believes in good faith that a FedNow transaction was a result of fraudulent activity, there is a requirement that they report that transaction. Now, as I previously mentioned, the operating procedure for the FedNow service will supplement the terms of OC8. Among other things, the procedures will also introduce specific requirement to report fraud using a FedNow fraud classifier model. So make sure you read the operating procedure and other business documents on this specific section. Now, before we move on to the next section, Appendix C has 2 important definitions that I want to point out and I want to make sure we pay particular attention to today. Those 2 sections are the unusual payment order, which is section 1.2.1, and the reportable transfer section, which is section 1.2.2. So starting with the unusual payment order section. Unusual payment order is defined as any payment order sent or received by a FedNow participant through the FedNow service that was authorized by a FedNow sender when sent to the FedNow service, but a FedNow participant learns otherwise may have resulted from fraudulent activity. Right? So once the FedNow participant learns otherwise that it may have resulted from a fraudulent activity, that makes it an unusual payment order. However, not every unusual payment order is reportable, right? So what makes it a reportable transfer? So you go to 1.2.2, and with 1.2.2, reportable transfer means any funds transfer completed in part to the FedNow service based on the unusual payment order we just talked about, and that the FedNow participant believes in good faith was the result of fraudulent activity. So once again, there's a good faith belief of the unusual payment order resulted from fraudulent activity, then it rises to the level of becoming a reportable transfer. Now, Section 2.0 of Appendix C discusses when to report and the obligation on each the sender and the receiver. Casey, I'm going to ask you for some help here. Can you help us understand what the operating circular provides on this end?
Yes, so from an operating procedures perspective, the section of the operating procedures related to fraud reporting is not available on the public website, but it will be provided to participants during the FedNow service onboarding process. And while this section isn't available in the operating procedures publicly, there are multiple resources available on the FedNow Explorer site related to fraud, including information on the fraud classifier model that the FedNow service will be using. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Casey. So the other appendix that I mentioned earlier was Appendix D. And Appendix D deals specifically with the negative list. So financial institutions will be able to define a pair of routing, transit, and account number, and those can be included as part of the Reserve Bank validation check. So let me take us back to the payment flow side. If you go back to step 3 that Casey had described in the payment flow side, in step 3, if a payment message fails the validation check by the Reserve Bank in that step 3 of the payment flow against this negative list, and remember, the negative list is enabled by either the sending or the receiver FedNow participant, right? So if the payment message fails our validation check against the negative list, then the FedNow service will reject the payment. Similar to Appendix C, the first two provisions of Appendix D defines the terms, and the remaining provision of Appendix D outline requirements. Now, as I suspect you will be paying careful attention to these appendices after this conversation, I'll point out that as you're reading it, Section 3 of Appendix D specifically deals with maintaining the negative list accurate and also the obligation of a FedNow participant as to the negative list. Casey, what does the operating procedure say as far as negative list?
So the operating procedures provide additional details on how to enroll in the negative list service, either during onboarding or at a later time. They also provide details on how to maintain the negative list and the processing of a payment when the sender or receiver FI is enrolled in the negative list. And as you mentioned, the negative list option is intended to augment the participant's internal fraud mitigation practices. The negative list provides participants an option to include an additional business validation check during payment processing to reject instant payments if the entry pair is included in specific fields that match an entry pair on the sender or receiver FI's negative list. And each FI enrolled in the negative list will have a single negative list applicable for all their enrolled RTNs. And with that, Jesse, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Casey. So we are very excited at the level of interest that we are seeing within the FedNow community and the broader industry as we prepare for and we get closer to the launch of the FedNow service next year. And I'm going to take a quick pause to ask for the slide to be advanced, please. I believe we need to be on the next slide. What's next? Thank you. So besides working with our FedNow pilot participants, we're also engaging and starting to onboard those who are interested in becoming early adopters of the FedNow service. So if your organization is excited and ready to move forward with us, there are some immediate next steps that you can take to start this journey. The first one is to work with your account executive. So if you're already doing so, if you're working with your account executive, that's great news. To find your account executive, you can visit frbservices.org. Your account executive can take you through our instant payments assessment, which allows us to gather the necessary details on your organization's business needs and use cases for instant payments, and details on your payment processing and operations environment to ensure proper planning and readiness for the FedNow service. Once you have completed the readiness assessment, your account executive can customize a proposal for how the FedNow service can meet your organization's needs. So please contact your Federal Reserve Bank account executive for a readiness assessment today. Step 2 is actually onboarding to the FedNow service. Once you determine in collaboration with your account executive that you are ready to proceed with enrolling and onboarding with the FedNow service, you will be assigned an onboarding team consisting of your account executive and a FedNow onboarding manager. The FedNow onboarding manager will serve as your primary point of contact throughout the onboarding process and will coordinate with other Federal Reserve teams involved in this process. So the OBM, we have an acronym for everything. So the OBM is your onboarding manager, who will be your dedicated subject matter expert for the FedNow service and any onboarding topics and questions. Finally, the security procedure agreement. So my colleagues have covered the details around Operating Circular 8 during this presentation today. So step 3 involves formally enrolling in the FedNow service by completing and signing the relevant appendices of OC8. Appendix A is the FedNow Service Security Procedure Agreement to be completed by FIs wishing to be participants in the FedNow service. And Appendix B is the Service Provider Agreement for the FedNow service, which is to be used by a financial institution that is a FedNow service participant to authorize another entity to act as its service provider with respect to the FedNow service. So this appendix must be completed and signed by both the financial institution and the service provider. So hopefully these 3 simple steps can get you started on your journey to implementing the FedNow service, and we're also excited to support you during this journey. So at this point, we have run through the presentation, and we did promise that we would leave plenty of time to answer your questions. So I am going to moderate the Q&A, please, again, hopefully you have been submitting your questions using the Q&A function. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. And today, to help us get started, I am actually going to take a few questions that were submitted to us by this audience in advance of this webinar. So, but first of all, we're getting a lot of questions about today's deck and the recording, and whether there will be this will be made available after the webinar. So yes, definitely, we will be posting both the deck along with the reporting on FedNow Explorer within the next few weeks. So just visit FedNow Explorer, give us a little bit of time to post these materials, but you'll see them there at some point. All right, so let's get into the Q&A portion of our presentation today. So the first question I'm going to send over to Ingrid. And Ingrid, I think at the beginning of your presentation, you already showed a slide which shows where the audience can find OC8, but for clarity, tell us where we can find Operating Circular 8, including the appendices.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, so on slide 5, we talked about Operating Circular 8 being published on frbservices.org under the resources section. You can also search for Operating Circulars or Operating Circular 8 in the search tool there on frbservices.org and navigate to the Operating Circular page.
Great. So Casey, this is kind of related because I think the location of the operating procedures, it's where the audience can find Operating Circular 8. So where can we find the operating procedures?
So the publicly available sections of the operating procedures can also be found, like you said, in the same location as Operating Circular 8. I will call out that there are 6 sections of the operating procedures that are not available on the public website, but will be provided to participants during the FedNow service onboarding process.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Ingrid, this seems to be a question that has been very popular, and it relates to what operating circulars are applicable to service providers.
Thanks, Jesse. So it's going to depend on what services the service provider is involved with, but for the FedNow Service, Operating Circular 8 will govern as well as OC5, and that's which governs electronic connections.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. So, Michelle, now it's your turn. How would you recommend organizations work with their legal departments to prepare for the FedNow service and understand the requirements of OC8?
Thank you for that question, Jesse. So there are various resources available to financial institution and service provider. But as Casey talked about on our earlier side, I would start with the FedNow Service Readiness Guide, as well as the FedNow Service Operating Procedure, which were both covered in the slide with the various documentation we've provided so far. They'll give you a good sense of how sort of operationally how our service works. Additional information and resources can be available on the FedNow Explorer website. You can find the FedNow Explorer website if you go to any search engine and you type in FedNow Explorer. It should pop up. It should be one of the earlier search, and it'll guide you through some of these things in the FedNow service. In addition, I think it behoove you everyone to review and understand Regulation J, which was updated and finalized just in May, and it governs really the funds transfer over the FedNow service.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the plug for FedNow Explorer. I really do agree with you that that is a great place to go for all kinds of information related to the FedNow service. So, Casey, what are the expectations on FedNow participants regarding managing their balance? This is another popular question that I have come across before.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So participants are required under the operating circular to maintain actually and collected funds in their settlement account to settle FedNow transactions consistent with Federal Reserve policies, including the Federal Reserve policy on payment system risk. The FedNow service provides reports so that participants can reconcile their FedNow service activities, and participants must monitor their balance to ensure appropriate funding. The reports and reconciliation section of the operating procedures does contain further details on this topic.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Don't go anywhere because I have a next question for you as well. Where can we find additional details related to the network limit for liquidity management transfers and for customer credit transfers?
So the operating procedures have a section titled Network Limits, which detail out these limits, but the customer credit transfer maximum transaction value limit is set at 500,000, and then the liquidity management transfer maximum transaction value limit is set at 2,500,000. I will also call out that there's information related to this as well on the FedNow Explorer site.
Great, thank you. And I think that our audience by now is getting the sense that FedNow Explorer is really where you can find a lot of this stuff. And hopefully you guys will find it really easy to use. You can either search the city, search for a topic. So please leverage that resource. All right, Michelle. I think you covered part of this during one of your slides. Maybe this is a more direct question on will participants be able to use the FedNow service for international transfers?
Okay, yeah, the short answer is not right now. So while the service will not support cross-border payment initially, the Federal Reserve does acknowledge that instant payment are quickly gaining popularity around the world. So I'm just going to reiterate, as you said, I mentioned before. So like that section 9.1.2 that stated that FedNow participant may not send a payment order to the FedNow service and that to an originator or a beneficiary that's not a FedNow participant or a holder of a deposit account on the books of the United States. So I just want to reiterate that section. Now, however, the service use of the internationally recognized ISO 20022 message specification can help advance the global interoperability with other schemes across the globe. At this moment, we'll continue to evaluate the cost and benefits of expanding the FedNow service to support cross payments in the future.
Great, thank you. Let me tell you, I love the questions that are coming in because they help clarify information that you guys have covered through the slides. So I would encourage the audience to keep going as well. So, Ingrid, another topic that you touched on during your part. Can a respondent FI use their correspondent bank that they currently have a relationship with for FedNow service transactions?
Thanks, Jesse. So a correspondent bank, or what we call a correspondent, is a financial institution that maintains a master account and has agreed to maintain a settlement account for another FedNow participant. I know we covered that concept on one of our earlier slides, but an FI, financial institution needs to work with their current correspondent to determine if that correspondent is going to agree to maintain the settlement account, and if that correspondent is prepared to serve in that role, and under which type of profiles. Casey talked to us about the different types of profiles, so need to talk to your correspondent about that. Settlement relationships are established, updated, and terminated by completing Operating Circular 1 Appendix 2, this transaction and service fee settlement authorization form. So that can also be found on frbservices.org. But in terms of profiles, correspondents are going to be required to have a FedNow participant profile if they want the ability to send or receive messages, including receiving account debit, credit notifications, and reporting via ISO 20022 messaging through the FedNow service. So if a correspondent does not wish to receive those messages, including those reports from the FedNow service or access to the FedNow interface, they will not need a participant profile.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. Casey, I think this is a topic near and dear to your heart. So what are the requirements for participants and service providers related to certification?
Yes, thanks, Jesse. So there are requirements for financial institutions and service providers as it relates to certification prior to operating in our FedNow service production environment. So the certification has two parts: certification of messaging and certification of operational readiness. And as FedNow participants on board, the test cases related to certification of messaging will be provided to them. So for operational readiness, so the certification of operational readiness, this requires the financial institution or the service provider to attest to their ability to meeting all the requirements detailed in the operating circulars, the operating procedures, and the technical specifications. And similar to some of the other questions that we asked today, there is more information provided in the operating procedures. And for this one, it's specifically in the section titled FedNow Service Customer Testing Environment Overview and Certification Details.
Great. I do have to say that this is also a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I did cover during my slide, the middle step was the onboarding process. So I know that for many who are, depending on where they are on their journey, some of this information, especially if you're reading it in a document, may seem a little bit overwhelming. But no worries, because again, we mentioned an onboarding team. And as you prepare for onboarding and start going through the onboarding process, we will have a team to help you go through the different steps and prepare for the testing phase and the certification testing phase. So, but again, as Casey indicated, please start here, and no worries, we'll have more support coming your way once you start your journey of onboarding with us. So Casey, don't go anywhere. The next one is also for you. Do FedNow participants need to respond to transactions 24/7, 365?
Yes, so each FedNow participant and service provider with applicable participation types should maintain the ability to receive and, if applicable, send messages through the FedNow service and make funds immediately available to its customers on a 24-hour basis. So more details we talked about earlier in this session and also available in the operating procedures, but short answer is yes in terms of response 24/7 by 365.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Michelle, you're up next. Another very frequently asked question in my mind. Can more information be provided on the immediate funds availability requirement for financial institutions whose core provider is not 24/7 enabled?
This kind of continued, as I mentioned earlier, but continuing sort of the same long thread, as Casey talked about, immediate funds available requirements are covered in Regulation J, right? So, and Regulation J was amended to govern fund transfer through the FedNow service. Reg J requires the beneficiary's bank to make funds available to the beneficiary immediately after it has accepted a payment order, right? It's instant payment, it requires it's immediate after accepted payment order. There is a section in the operating procedure titled the participant and FedNow service availability expectation, and section 5 of the current version of the operating procedure. And that section further defines immediately to be, as I mentioned, as soon as practicable, but no longer than a few seconds. So that's really the standard, as soon as practicable, but no longer than a few seconds. Now, that's the requirement of Reg J. Financial institutions are encouraged to discuss with their co-provider how they can meet this requirement.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. The next question is for Ingrid. So this goes back a little bit to the payments flow that Casey described at the beginning of the presentation. And it relates to an accept without posting message and whether settlement occur when the money is exchanged between the two financial institutions, or whether settlement is subject to closure of sanctions processing on the creditor agent's end.
Good question, Jesse. So if a receiver financial institution responds to an instant payment message with this accept without post response, then the FedNow service will process and settle the payment, debiting and crediting the sender FI and the receiver FI's master account or that of their correspondent. However, in the case of an accept without post response, the receiver financial institution is relieved of that obligation to make funds immediately available to its customer, providing it an opportunity to investigate. And then the values message section of the operating procedure is going to give you more details on this topic.
Great, thank you. Casey, what is the time frame for a receiver FI to make a final decision after issuing an accept without posting?
So the reserve banks require a participant that's using accepting without post or ACWP response to either reject and return the funds or make the funds available to the intended recipient by midnight Eastern time of the next standard business day, unless the participant continues to be concerned that the recipient is not entitled to receive the payment, and taking action would be impermissible under applicable law. So if that's the case, then the reserve banks do require that the participants provide a status of pending to the FedNow service sender by the ACWP availability deadline. A status update is also required upon resolution of the participant's investigation or in response to inquiries from the FedNow service sender on the status. I encourage everyone to reference the consolidated response time section of the operating procedures for more information on this.
Great. Okay, Ingrid, this is some clarification here regarding the accept without posting response. Can it be used for other circumstances besides compliance?
Thanks, Jesse. So accept without post can only be used when a financial institution has reasonable cause to believe that the beneficiary is not entitled or permitted to receive the payment, as provided in Reg J, which Michelle mentioned extensively earlier. So this includes for compliance reasons or fraud.
All right, Michelle, you and Casey touched on the negative list. Is the negative list separate and apart from an OFAC or sanctions check?
Hope you can see me. The light in my office just turned off and I haven't been moving enough. But so the negative list and OFAC aren't related. So the negative list, as I mentioned, will be participant-generated lists, and they can use it to manage their risk. If the entries appears in the message, in the payment message, consistent with our formal requirement, but as entries are on the negative list, then the FedNow service will reject the payment based on the negative list entries created by the FedNow participant. However, negative list and OFAC are related to OFAC.
Okay, thank you. Don't go anywhere. Let's talk about fraud still. When reporting fraud, how should FedNow participants categorize fraud?
So to facilitate consistent reporting, the FedNow service will utilize a fraud classify model for the categorization of fraud. And that's in the operating procedure. And the FIs and service provider are encouraged to use the fraud classify model to facilitate common fraud language and encourage industry dialogue. Under that model, fraudulent activity processed through the FedNow service are categorized into specific classification type. And some of those types that you will see include such things as there's a product and service fraud, a relationship and trust fraud. There's one category called embezzlement. There's another category, synthetic identity fraud. There is a couple more categories called the false claim category, the compromised credential category, and the impersonating authority, authorized party category. I think that's the breadth of category. However, further details regarding this fraud classifier model, again, available on the FedNow Explorer.
All right. Still for you, what happens if two financial institutions cannot reach an agreement on a resolution following an investigation for fraudulent activity?
Okay. Now, if you go to section 2. So this will be in appendix C of operating circular A. So if you go to section 2.3 of appendix C of OCA, you'll see that the Federal Reserve Bank are responsible only for transmitting the information they receive from a FedNow participant, reporting the reportable transfer to the other FedNow participant involved in the reportable transfer. That the resolution is to be managed by the two financial institutions. So we do expect the financial institution involved in the transaction to work on it together once they've deemed it to be a reportable transfer and it's been reported in a FedNow service.
All right. Casey, how will the Reserve Bank support FedNow participants and end customers?
So the reserve banks will have support available 24/7 by 365 to participating financial institutions and service providers to respond to questions or issues related to the FedNow service. And the operating procedures provide more details on the phone number to call for issues. FIs are responsible for supporting their end customers, such as individuals or businesses.
All right, thank you. And so I am keeping an eye on the time. We have a few minutes, but we still have a couple of questions to get through. So this is either for Michelle or Ingrid. You take your pick. How does the Fed plan for sanctions compliance with the FedNow service?
Ingrid, let me take this one and you can take the next one if there is more questions. So the reserve banks will impose compliance-related requirements on the participant that will be consistent with legal and supervisory requirements that are applicable to federally supervised institutions. Now, these requirements will apply to FedNow participants that have processed the customer's transfer, and they will relate to a FedNow participant overall compliance program, their customer due diligence, and then their customer-based screening against the sanction list. Now, participants may also use the accept without posting response message I think Casey talked about if they do screen incoming payments they receive over the service. Again, here we will ask participants to consult with their legal counsel and the recent guidance from OFAC to better understand what their obligations are under federal law.
Great. Ingrid, I'm going to send this question over to you because you cover the topic. Are there any regs governing respondent-correspondent relationships? And what does an FI gain when allowing another FI to use their master account?
Thanks, Jesse. So we're not able to provide, advice on regulatory requirements that may be applicable to a bank that engages in correspondent banking activities. But I would say from a service standpoint, the correspondent relationship will be governed by Operating Circular 1, which we've mentioned a few times now, and then that governs master accounts, and then Operating Circular 8, which obviously governs the FedNow service.
All right, thank you, Ingrid. And then Michelle, this is seems to be a popular question during this webinar and a topic, I guess. Can you go over the negative list one more time, please?
Okay, no, absolutely, I can do that. So fraud reporting is meant to aid the sending and receiving DI in investigating and remediating possible fraudulent transaction that was sent through the FedNow service. The receiving depository institution will be required to use reasonable effort to aid in this effort. We are hopeful that this collaboration between the two institutions will help reduce the incidence of fraud overall with respect to the transfer through the FedNow service. That's really the intent behind the negative lists. But quickly, the negative list, they'll have a routing and a transit number that they'll have there, and it will be generated by the FedNow participant. And our process is that the FedNow service will, again, step 3 of Casey's payment flowchart, the validation check will be against that negative list. And if it doesn't pass that validation check, then the service will reject the payment.
All right, thank you all. So we are at time. So let me thank everybody for this great and lively Q&A. And before we wrap up today's webinar, on behalf of my colleagues and the FedNow team, I want to reiterate our commitment to being transparent about our progress and providing periodic updates throughout the year as we achieve key milestones in the delivery of the FedNow service. If you have any questions that weren't answered today, please reach out to us via the FedNow community mailbox, or you can contact your account executive. And another plug for FedNow Explorer, this site offers a wide range of content to help you get to know and prepare for the FedNow service. We continually add new content to the site, so we encourage you to sign up for FedNow News and make sure you receive updates on all things related to FedNow. And if you haven't done so yet, please join us with the FedNow community. As a community member, you'll receive regular first look announcements, access to educational resources, and invitations to member-only events. If you're a service provider, joining the community also means participation in the Ecosystem Accelerator group and the opportunity to present your instant payment solutions to financial institutions and end users through the Service Provider Showcase on the FedNow Explorer site. Following today's webinar, we'll be sending a short survey so you can let us know what you thought about today's session. Please be on the lookout for that email. And we're recording today's discussion. We'll post it to FedNow Explorer within the next few weeks, so please stay tuned. And again, thank you for coming. Thank you to my fellow speakers for joining me today. The great presentation and your answers to the questions, and have a great day.